The blockade runners of the American Civil War were seagoing steamships that were used to make their way through the Union blockade that extended some 3,500 miles along the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico coastlines and the lower Mississippi River. To get through the blockade, these ships, many of them specially built for speed, had to cruise by undetected, usually at night. If spotted, the runners would then attempt to outmaneuver or simply outrun any Union ships on blockade patrol. The typical blockade runners were privately owned vessels, often operating with a letter of marque issued by the Confederate States of America. These vessels would carry cargoes to and from neutral ports, often located in Nassau and Cuba, where neutral merchant ships in turn carried these cargoes, usually coming from or destined to England or other points abroad. Inbound ships usually brought badly needed supplies and mail to the Confederacy, while outbound ships often exported cotton, tobacco and other goods for trade and revenue, while also carrying important mail and correspondence to suppliers and other interested parties in Europe, most often in England. Most of the guns and other ordnance of the Confederacy was imported from England via blockade runners. Some blockade runners made many successful runs, while many others were either captured or destroyed. There were an estimated 2,500–800 attempts to run the blockade, with at least an 80% success rate. However, by the end of the Civil War, the Union Navy had captured more than 1,100 blockade runners and had destroyed or run aground another 355 vessels. Background: when the American Civil War broke out on April 12, 1861, the newly formed Confederate States of America had no ships to speak of in its navy. In the months leading up to the war, the Confederate government was well aware of the naval supremacy of the North and sought the help of Great Britain, which had great interests in the plantations of the South. The British became the primary shipbuilders and sources of supply for the Confederate government for the duration of the Civil War. Several courses of action soon developed. In 1861, the Southern Fleet only consisted of about 35 ships, of which 21 were steam-driven. The Confederacy was also in dire need of many basic supplies, and without the resources of the industrial North, it had to look to other venues for its supplies. Coming to their aid, an experienced and former U.S. naval captain, Raphael Semmes, devised a plan by which to thwart the naval supremacy of the North. He proposed a militia of privateers which would both strike at the North's merchant ships and provide supplies to the South by outrunning or evading the ships of the Union blockade. Confederate President Jefferson Davis approved of the plan. On April 15, President Lincoln issued his first proclamation, calling out 75,000 troops in response to the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter. On April 17, Davis issued a proclamation, offering a letter of marque to anyone who would offer their ship in the service of the Confederacy. To this end, British investors were the most prolific in offering such aid. The North refused to recognize the sovereignty of the Confederacy along with its right to issue letters of marque, and in little time, on April 19, Lincoln issued a second proclamation, threatening the Confederacy with a blockade along its coastlines, i.e. Scott's Anaconda Plan extended along the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico coastlines and up into the lower Mississippi River. Lincoln's proclamation also contained a threat that any actions against the Union by crews of ships acting under a Confederate letter of marque would be treated as pirates and subject to prosecution for such crimes, which usually called for the death penalty. In response, Davis countered with threats of retaliation, while the British also proclaimed its refusal to concur with Lincoln's proclamation in nearby Nassau and its territorial waters. Lincoln's proposed blockade was met with mixed criticism among some of his contemporaries. Thaddeus Stevens angrily referred to it as a great blunder and an absurdity, arguing that we were blockading ourselves and in the process would be recognizing the Confederacy as a belligerent of war. Soon after Lincoln announced the blockade, the profitable business of running supplies through the blockade to the Confederacy began. At first the actual blockade was slow to materialize, as the task of patrolling thousands of miles of coastline was enormous. The blockade, considered by some to be little more than a paper blockade, Wilmington wasn't blockaded until July 14, 1861, 3 months after Lincoln's proclamation. An enormous naval industry evolved which brought great profits for shipbuilders, shippers, and suppliers alike. Throughout the conflict, mail was carried also by blockade runners to and from ports in the West Indies, Nassau and Bermuda. But soon federal forces began to more effectively enforce the coastal blockade and establish squadrons at the various southern ports, while also setting up roving patrols just outside British territorial waters in the Caribbean, most notably in the Bahamas. As the risk of capture or destruction increased, amateur blockade runners began to cease operations, with most of the trade now being handled by courageous sea captains who were soon using specially made steamers that allowed them to evade or outrun Union ships on blockade patrol. Union blockade. General Winfield Scott was one of the few senior men in Washington who realized that this could be a long war, and he developed an appropriate naval strategy that would make a decisive impact on the war's outcome. This was a part of his famous Anaconda Plan that employed a naval blockade around the coastline of the Confederacy with the idea of adversely affecting its economy and supply lines. Because of the thousands of miles of coastline with its many rivers, bays and inlets, the blockade proved largely ineffectual during the first couple of years of the war. This allowed blockade runners to import military supplies to the Confederacy with relative ease. Deliveries of armaments and military supplies to the South and cotton to England were coordinated by military agents like Major Walker, who played a key role in supplying the Confederacy. Walker also served as fiscal agent. Lincoln's proclamation raised issues with England and other powers relating to international law. In the midst of a naval blockade, the Confederacy received an almost steady supply of arms and other goods from Europe along with mail. At the same time, it was exporting cotton and other commodities to France and England, whose textile industries were greatly dependent on these southern exports. Outgoing runners would also carry mail. During the course of the Civil War, most of the attempts to run the blockade succeeded, but as the months passed, the captains and crews on blockade patrol became more seasoned and grew wiser to the various tactics employed by blockade runners. During the last 2 years of the war, the only vessels capable of getting through the blockade were the blockade runners that were specifically designed for speed. During the first year of the war, the southern ports in the Gulf of Mexico experienced a great deal of blockade running activity. In the first 10 months, New Orleans, the largest cotton port in the world, gave port to more than 300 blockade runners. When New Orleans fell to Union forces on April 25, 1862, the center for blockade running activity shifted to Mobile, Alabama. With New Orleans and the Mississippi River secured, blockade efforts by the Union Navy along the Gulf Coast were greatly increased, forcing blockade runners to use the port at Galveston. When Mobile and its port came under siege in the summer of 1864, all activity there moved to Galveston. Blockade runners used Havana as a stopover point for transferring cargoes to and from neutral ships supplying the Confederacy. The newly formed Confederacy was not officially recognized by the various foreign powers, a situation that led the seceded states to seek the aid of various private shipping companies and other businesses, especially overseas, where there was interest and willing compliance to sell and ship the much-needed supply and ordnance to the Confederacy. To handle its important supply dealings and various business affairs, the Confederate government turned to John Fraser and Company, a well-known, patriotic, and respected Charleston-based importing and exporting company which was well connected in England, France, and elsewhere. Established in 1835, John Fraser had turned the business over to his son, John Augustus Fraser, and his senior partner George Alfred Trenholm, who would later become Confederate Secretary of the Treasury. Fraser, Trenholm and Company operated out of Liverpool and New York. By 1860 the company had 5 seagoing vessels, among them the Kate, the Cecil and the Herald, making shipping runs from Liverpool to New York and Charleston and back again. When the Southern states seceded from the Union, it opened the door to even greater business, and in little time nearly all of their business was with the CSA. The firm of Fraser, Trenholm and Company in Liverpool became the common connection for the Confederacy's naval and financial dealings in Europe. Prior to the actual battles of the war, Fraser and Company had already begun negotiations for steamship service between England and points along the southern coast of the Confederacy. Taking advantage of the fact that neither side was fully prepared for war, George Trenholm and his partners began shipping arms from Liverpool and New York to Charleston. The state of South Carolina was the buyer for these first shipments, which in turn sold them to the Confederate government for a substantial profit. Before war broke out, military arms for the CSA states were in short supply. There was also little gunpowder stored among the seceded states, and the availability of fuses and percussion caps was also very limited. There was no machine to produce them in any of the Confederate states. Powder supplies in Florida were so low that, in April 1861, General John B. Grayson warned Jefferson Davis in Richmond, "As sure as the sun rises, unless cannon powder, etc., be sent to Florida in the next 30 days, she will fall into the hands of the North. Nothing human can prevent it." The same urgent demand for military ordnance and supplies was dispatched to Richmond from every military center throughout the South. Because of the incursions of the Union Army, the Confederate Navy was also in very short supply of coal, with the only domestic sources being located in North Carolina and Alabama. The well-funded Importing and Exporting Company of Georgia was founded in 1863 by Garza W. Bug Lamar, a Wall Street banker who had returned to his native Georgia at the outbreak of hostilities. At this time the Confederate government depended almost entirely on privately owned blockade runners. However, the leaders of the Confederacy had enough foresight to realize that the Federation needed its own vessels to bring in supplies. Acting for the Confederate Navy Department, James Dunwoody Bullock began procuring vessels in Europe, most notably the CSS Atlanta, which made its famous run into Savannah carrying 10,000 Enfield rifles, 1,000,000 cartridges, 2,000,000 percussion caps, and 400 barrels of gunpowder, along with swords, revolvers, and other military supplies. Central figures coordinating the business affairs of the CSA, with shipbuilders, purchasing agents, suppliers, and shippers in Liverpool, Nassau, Wilmington and other ports, involved the concerted efforts of a number of notable men and shipping firms. Foremost in this effort were Major Josiah C. Gorgas and Fraser, Trenholm and Company, who worked closely with Gorgas, the Confederate Naval Secretary, and other agents. Josiah C. Gorgas, because the South lacked the industrial resources of the North, it was forced to seek military supplies from other, often overseas, sources. Blockade runners became the chief means of supplying the blockaded Confederacy. Ships of the Confederate Navy used for running the blockade were employed by Confederate Chief of Ordnance, Major Josiah Gorgas, a West Point graduate of 1841 who prior to the war had worked in the United States Ordnance Bureau and had served in nearly every arsenal in the nation. While working in the South, he became sympathetic to the secessionist movement and eventually sided with the Confederacy, becoming the head of the Confederate Ordnance Bureau. Gorgas liaised with Charles Priola, who headed Trenholm's Liverpool office, arranging for the shipping of arms and other supplies. Most of the arms sent to the Confederacy departed from Liverpool. During the summer of 1861, Gorgas stockpiled supplies and prepared his first load of cargo, while Trenholm's company procured a suitable ship for the voyage. A 1,200-ton iron-hulled steamer, the Bermuda, was chosen to make the voyage. Caleb Hughes to coordinate the business and the buying of weapons and supplies in England. Gorgas relied on agents Captain Caleb Hughes and Major Edward C. Anderson. Under Gorgas' direction, Hughes served as an arms procurement agent and purchasing specialist, well known for his successful acquisition of weapons contracts with various European nations including the United Kingdom and Austria, among others. Anderson was also sent to aid Hughes and check on his activity. Hughes arranged the sale and procurement of rifles and other ordnance from the London Armoury Company, which became the chief supplier of arms to the Confederacy throughout the war. By February 1863, the Armoury had shipped over 70,000 rifles to the Confederacy. Hughes was also owner of several seagoing steamers used in blockade running and made several trips to Europe and back aboard these vessels. While in Europe, Hughes represented the Confederate War Department and Ordnance Bureau throughout the entire war and arranged for credit to be extended when funds were short. These men also acted as liaisons with Charles Priolo of Fraser, Trenham & Co. in Liverpool. Through him they would procure the vessels and arrange for the shipment of goods to the Confederacy. Bullock would work in close correspondence with Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory in the procurement of several British-made blockade-running vessels. James Dunwoody Bullock, the half-brother of noted CSN officer Irvin Bullock. James Dunwoody Bullock was the Confederacy's chief foreign agent in Great Britain. Inside 2 months after the attack on Fort Sumter, Bullock arrived at Liverpool, where he established his base of operations. As his first order of business, he made contact with Confederate commissioners Hon. William Yancey and Hon. Dudley Mann, in London. After being welcomed, they discussed the diplomatic situation. Since they had not been officially received by the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, as the Confederate government had not permanently established themselves as an independent foreign power, Bullock then established a relationship with the shipping firm of Fraser, Trenham & Company, where he set up a conference with the Fraser-Trenham officials who were the designated financial agents of the new Confederate government. They arranged for the buying and selling of cotton, being ultimately responsible for shipping approximately 7/8 of all the cotton exported from the southern states during the war. Bullock also arranged for the construction and purchase of the Florida, the Alabama and the Shenandoah. In 1863, Bullock contracted with the Laird shipyard for the construction of 2 ironclad rams to be used against the Union blockade. However, if it could be proven that the contract for building these ships was in violation of Britain's neutrality law, the ships could be seized. The Union's minister to Britain, Charles F. Adams, tried to do just that, but he could only gather circumstantial evidence, as Bullock went to great lengths to conceal his movements. Adams threatened the British government with reprisal, that if the rams escaped, the United States would consider it an act of war. After further consideration, British authorities seized the 2 vessels and from that point on kept a close watch on Bullock and other such propositions made by the Confederate government, forcing CSA officials to turn to the French for future commissions. Following that turn of events, Bullock then commissioned a shipbuilder in France to construct the Stonewall, another armored ram. John Newland Maffitt. On April 11, 1862, George W. Randolph, the new Confederate Secretary of War, appointed John Newland Maffitt, an officer of the Confederate Navy and a notorious privateer with a long success record, to be the acting agent in Nassau for the Confederacy. Nassau was one of several offshore stopover points for shipments coming into or leaving the Confederate States. Maffitt's duties were broad. You were authorized to take entire control of all vessels loaded with arms and munitions for the Confederate States. Maffitt's duties included selecting ports of entry and discharging and replacing officers and crews as needed. His only condition was that he first confer with Lewis Halinger, Confederate agent in Nassau. Maffitt would later be given command of the CSS Albemarle.